Our format tonight will be each speaker will get about 15 to 20 minutes to give their presentation as to what their faith tradition says about the topic of salvation. And then we will have 20 minutes of dialogue where each speaker can interact with one another and respond to what they briefly stated. Then we will open it up for 20 minutes of Q&A, and Talha and I will be sifting through those questions as Rick and Fahad dialogue with one another. After that, we will have a time of closing. And so, with that being said, we would like to introduce our first speaker, Fahad.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise is due to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, and all of the prophets, including Jesus, Moses, John the Baptist, Abraham, Isaac, and all the great prophets. So, tonight's topic, I think, is very, very interesting. And I wanted to start off just in this mindset. Because a lot of times when you come to a particular setting like this, you kind of come with a mindset to say, I'm going to go root for my team. And so certain epithets come to mind, like what is, the Christian understanding of salvation and what is the Islamic understanding of salvation. But tonight what I'd like us to do is try our utmost best. And I know, obviously we come from a wide range of, psycho-spiritual, emotive states with backgrounds and families and things like that. And it's going to be a challenge, but try to put those epithets aside for a second and look at the concept of salvation as objectively as possible. And I think there's three tools that we can kind of use to judge the concept of salvation itself. One of those is to say, is the concept of salvation, is it rationally clear and logical? That's number one. Number two, is it spiritually meaningful? And number three, is it intuitively sound? Now, one of the things is that when we have these conversations, from the Quran, we are always told to start with those things that are similar. So the thing that I'd like to start with, and it makes sense to start here before I dive right into the concept of salvation, is the concept of God. And I think we can start with a point of agreement. And that point of agreement is that all of us who are Christians and Muslims, we believe in God. So that's a good starting point. But even beyond that, I think we can agree that our conceptualization of God is that God is maximally loving and maximally forgiving. And I'm hoping that we can come to terms with that. Now, that being said, I wanted to put forth a kind of a deductive scenario and then use this concept of salvation in Islam and juxtapose that with the concept of salvation in Christianity and kind of put it to the test. So the deductive format that I wanted to look at, is that premise, so deductions have typically two premises and a conclusion. So premise number one, that for God to be maximally loving, he has to be maximally forgiving. I don't think there's any sort of disagreement here. I think that's pretty acceptable. It's the second one that's going to be contentious. And so bear with me. We spoke about commonalities, but obviously there's going to be differences as well. So premise number two, the biblical God is not maximally forgiving. Therefore, the biblical God is not maximally loving. Now, that being the case, that being the deductive setup that I have, premise B is what's the controversy, or what's controversial here. So let's now take a look at salvation and see how do we substantiate premise B. And we can start right at the beginning, and that being the story of Adam. Now, again, as a commonality, both of our traditions believe in the prophet Adam. We believe that he was in paradise, that he sinned. Now, of course, when you look at the biblical narration, the narrative in the Bible, and you look at the Quranic narration, you find that there are certain differences. And maybe someone would say that those differences are indeed significant. Who ate from the tree? What was going on exactly? The serpent versus the devil, and so on and so forth. But the key point that I wanted to make in terms of the story of Adam is this. When we look at the Christian understanding, we find that Adam sins and the story ends. And of course, then Adam is cast down on the earth as a punishment. Now, of course, one of the good things is that I have Rick here, so if there's anything that I'm saying that's incorrect, he's going to correct me. So, that, from my understanding, is what the mainstream Christianity or mainline Christianity has, or what the biblical narrative teaches. Now, when we juxtapose that with the Quranic narrative, we see that the story doesn't just end with Adam and Eve sinning. In fact, at the end of the story, what happens is that God teaches Adam how to ask for forgiveness. فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ. God gives Adam the words of how to ask for forgiveness. And so Adam then asks God for forgiveness. Oh God, forgive me. I wronged myself, and so on and so forth. فَتَابَ عَلَيْهِ. And then God says, and so we forgave him. What's really interesting is the Arabic word here, taba, which means to turn, to lovingly turn to Adam, even though he's faltered, even though he sinned, and forgive him. إِنَّهُ هُوَ التَّوَّابُ الرَّحِيمُ. Indeed, God is the one that's ever turning, ever accepting of the repentance, and the most merciful. So right at the onset, we see that there's this understanding of the Adamic paradigm. So one aspect is, was Adam sent to earth as a punishment? From the Islamic worldview, from the Islamic paradigm, indeed he wasn't. Because we know this, because when God speaks to the angels, he tells them the plan ahead of time. He says, I'm going to create this human being and I'm going to send them to earth. This is before we're even talking about Adam. So that Adamic paradigm, or that Adamic prototype, archetype rather, you find that is what is tied to the human project. In other words, and this is where we come into the Islamic concept of salvation, in other words, that the human project is such that when the human being slips and sins, it is not a concept that is tied to something outside of the human being or to a specific event, but it is a direct relationship with the divine. That the person with their heart and their soul and just says, oh Allah, oh God, forgive me. And there's a direct divine connection, and that's it. There's nothing that comes in between that. And of course, when we speak about the concept of salvation, it leads us to understand what is the purpose of life in and of itself. Because from an Islamic paradigm, the purpose of life, to put it very simply, is to worship God. But what does that term mean? Worship in the Islamic paradigm is to love God to the maximum, as much as you can, is to know God and to obey God. And every human, what you'll find is that every human worships something. In fact, there's a very famous author, Martin Lings, he said, man cannot not worship. There is something that you love the most, and that could be yourself. There's something that you want to know the most. It could be yourself, it could be, something else, some topic, some concept, some ideology, whatever it might be. And there's something that you're going to obey the most. From an Islamic paradigm, those concepts, or that love, that obedience, that knowledge, to know, should be at its highest point when it comes to God. And that is the very purpose and drive and meaning of life. So, we have this understanding. And by the way, when we say that it's the concept of worship has to do with loving God at as much as you can, to the highest state, the highest possible as much as you can, and submitting to God and obeying God, you have to have both of them. Because you can imagine now a father who loves his child, but that father is not worshiping his child. You don't call that worship, at least in the Islamic paradigm. Now, conversely, you can imagine a tyrannical king, and his subjects may submit to him. They may obey him. But that isn't worship either. It's only when you couple this, the highest state of love, coupled with the highest state of obedience and the highest state of knowing, that's what is known as worship from the Islamic paradigm. And you find this in the Adamic archetype that's presented right at the get-go, in terms of the story of Adam. And so, to put it very simply, the process of salvation is that when a person slips, they ask God for forgiveness and God forgives them. There's a direct relationship with the divine. Now, let me come back to what I had mentioned a few minutes ago. And that was, And that was the deduction that I put forward, the deductive argument that I put forward. And that was, just to repeat it, I said premise number one is that for God to be maximally loving, He has to be maximally forgiving. And I said that I don't think that's something that's contentious. Premise B, I said that the biblical God is not maximally forgiving. Conclusion, or rather, what we find from that is that therefore, the biblical God is not maximally loving. So that being the case, why is B true? Now that we've understood the concept of salvation from an Islamic paradigm, I'm saying that B is true because what we find from the Christian paradigm, to the best of my understanding, is that God's love is rooted in suffering. Because God's forgiveness of humanity is outside of the connection between the human and the divine directly. It is based on an event that happened in a certain epoch of time. The entire forgiveness of humanity is something that's outside of that loving relationship between the person and the divine. It's like it's a third-party transaction, right? And so, is it maximally loving, maximally forgiving for God, who we understand to be maximally loving and maximally forgiving? Is it maximally forgiving for God to put up this barrier, in a sense, and have it be based on an event that's outside of the direct human connection between the human and the divine? That's number one. Number two, and this is where I wanted to juxtapose the idea of that God forgave Adam. Now, this is vital in understanding the difference. Why? Because from that conception of God forgiving Adam, we understand the Islamic understanding of human anthropology. I don't mean what you study in school, the science of anthropology. I mean, what is the constitution of the human being? From an Islamic paradigm, the human being is born in what is known in Islamic parlance as upon the fitrah. What we could translate in a way or explain in a way to mean the original normative disposition. And that disposition that you start with is not one of sin and evil, but it's one of good. So it starts off from a position of goodness, not a position of evil and sin. So moving from there, is there an idea of maximal love for God to create human beings that are inherently sinful? Because it's as if you're starting from already having a distance between yourself and God. Or does it make more sense? Is it more rationally clear and logical when we have our conception of God being maximally loving and maximally forgiving to have human beings start in a state of goodness? Now, I mentioned this concept of being rationally clear and logical, but I also wanted to touch upon this idea of being spiritually meaningful. Because when we understand spiritual meaningful, what we have to understand is that if we have the Christian understanding of salvation and sin, and that human beings are born in an original sin and they're inherently sinful, are we saying that does that human sin, does that limit God's forgiveness? In other words, is sin greater than God? And that's something that I like us to think about. Because, you see, from the Islamic paradigm, and this is what you hear all the time, right? So when you turn on the TV and they show like crazy Muslims on TV, and what are they saying? Allahu Akbar! Right? That's what they're saying. What does that mean, though? That God is the greatest. There's nothing greater than God. There's no sin that's greater than God. And so when we understand who God is from an Islamic paradigm, we have to understand that God has attributes. All of the attributes of God that we understand are maximally perfect. He's maximally perfect in His love, maximally perfect in His mercy, maximally perfect in His justice, and so on and so forth. And as such, He's maximally perfect in His attributes and names, and that means that He has no deficiencies. And so He is not deficient in any way whatsoever. And so if the idea is that there's a sin that's greater than Allah, than God, are we saying that there is a realm, a domain where God's omnipotence doesn't reach? Is there a sin that's greater than God? And from an Islamic paradigm, we would say no. In fact, the Quran mentions this over and over and over again, When God, from our perspective, says, "Oh, my servants who have wronged yourself, la taqnatu min rahmatillah, do not despair from the mercy of God." That He forgives all sin. Jami'an is the word that's used there. He forgives all sins. There's no sin that's greater. Now there's one other aspect when I wanted to speak about the concept of spiritual meaningfulness. And that has to do with the idea of there being an event that covers all of the sins. And here what I'm specifically speaking about is the idea of God sending His Son to die for the sins of humanity. Now this particular concept, we have to ask, when a person, that's 18 minutes? 2 minutes, okay. That when a person, when they hold fast to this idea, are we saying that no matter what a person does, that they can enter paradise? Because if that's the case, that as long as you have this belief in that particular event and that it happened in the way that it happened, we're told that that's how it happened, we're supposed to believe in that. As long as you believe in that, you know, in the words of the great polymath and the erudite scholar, we can say, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who said, "It doesn't matter what you do." Because then how does it matter? If it doesn't have any concept of reward or punishment, doesn't that render human action in terms of morals meaningless? So I'll go ahead and stop there. I had a few more points, but I think time might be